So for part one, we looked at painting this image in grayscale over a plain white base, and then we buried that with candy. And I talked about how candy allows light to filter through each layer and then reflect off the surface underneath. So the easiest way to really take advantage of a candy is to change your base coat. So you can come in with a metallic or a pearlescent underneath your candy, and that will give you a much more dynamic effect, whether you're outside under the sun or even indoors under good lighting. So initially, I based this panel out the same as I did for part one, using AutoWare Sealer White. I came in over the top of that and put 3 or 4 coats of AutoWare Metallic Coarse White. Now metallics, due to the metallic in the paint, leaves a little bit of a textured finish. I prefer to work over a very smooth surface. So I came in with an automotive urethane clear, put a couple coats of clear over that, and then sanded it back so I've got a smooth surface to work on. That will protect the metallic paint underneath the artwork. It'll also afford me the opportunity to come in with either an eraser or maybe even a blade to reestablish highlights later. You don't necessarily want to come in with opaque white and reestablish highlights like we did in part one, due to the fact that the opaque paint is going to cover up the metallic. So if you're under good light, anywhere you put that opaque white, you're going to have dead spots in the metallic. I want all the metallic to shine through over the entire panel when this panel is finished. So that should also tell you that you don't want to necessarily use an opaque paint to render any part of this artwork on this panel. You can use transparents, but again, transparents are pigment based. So if you get enough coats, like in these really super dark areas, that's going to drown out that metallic. You're not going to get near the effect. So what I'm going to do is basically we're going to paint this entire artwork on this panel using nothing but candies. One thing worth mentioning before we put any color down is in part one, I actually used a pencil to roughly sketch out the design directly onto the panel, because I knew that the detail smoke black and the opaque white would cover up those lines in the end. You wouldn't be able to see them. In this case, we're using nothing but candies. So as you saw in part one, Candy 2.0 is 100% completely transparent, regardless of how many layers you put on this panel. If you draw it out with pencil first, even in the darkest darks, you're still going to see those pencil lines in the end. So you want to find a different way to transfer the image onto your artwork, whether you just want to freehand it directly onto the panel, or you can cut out a paper mask and spray lightly through areas of that mask to give yourself kind of a roadmap, or you can project the image onto the panel. There's a number of different ways you can do it. Just be aware that drawing directly onto the panel and then using candies will show pencil lines in the end. I'm using Candy 2.0 Midnight Blue to start this out, and this is just a circle template that you can buy in any art store, because I want to keep this edge pretty clean. I'm working off the cuff here, and what I mean by that is I didn't use any of the methods we talked about just a minute ago to transfer the image onto this panel, because again, we're working over a metallic. What I did do is I took this circle template and compared all the shapes on the template to the eye on the panel that we painted in part one. Once I figured out which shapes were closest to that eye, I tried to place it roughly in the same position on the panel as it was in part one, and that'll give me a baseline to build the rest of the image from. I don't know if it's visible on camera or not, but there's just a hint of overspray right there from when I used that circle template to get the center of this eye. That's another great thing about having a clear coat over this to protect the metallic underneath. I can take a little bit of Windex, squirt it onto a paper towel, and wipe that blemish right away. This part of the process is relatively the same as what we did in part one with the detail smoke black. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but some of you might be wondering, hey, does this guy realize the Hulk is green? Why is he using a blue? Well, if you watched part one, you probably heard me make the comment that I don't generally like to paint a black and white image if I know I'm going to bury it under candy. And the reason behind that is basically that, in my opinion, I think it leaves a dull, kind of a muted finish in the end. I like my artwork to be more rich and more vibrant. So if I were going to spray this panel in part two with the flat tone of candy like we did in part one, I would go about it in the same manner that I am now, starting off with a blue. And the reason behind the color choice is based on simple color theory. I know if I mix yellow and blue, I'll get a green. So I would choose to use blues for the very dark areas and probably yellows for the highlights, because I know when I cover that with a green candy in the end, not only will I get a super smooth, clean transition of color, but the colors will become more rich, more vibrant, and the blues that you see now will actually turn to almost a black without ever having to use black. In part one, I also talked about using your air pressure at 35 psi. To clarify, 35 psi is for if you're using a fan-tipped airbrush or even a minigun or a full-size spray gun for even coverage. 35 psi is what I've found to be optimal. If you're just doing general airbrush work like we are now, you can vary your air pressure to whatever you like. I'm around 20 psi here. Here I'm using a piece of quilt batting, and you'll also see me use a fabric softener dryer sheet just to add a little bit of texture. And for more on these techniques, you can check out my Cheap Tricks episode 1 video. Another question I get occasionally is, can you erase the Candy 2.0 just like you can the other Createx products? And the answer is yes. You can see here I'm using the Helix to go in and punch out some of the highlights in the corner of that eye. And towards the end of the video, you'll see me use the Helix again to clean up the iris of the eye, and then I'll also use a pencil eraser to come in and get some highlights just above the eye. Pretty happy with where the blue's at this point. There's one important thing I'd like to note that I don't normally put in my videos. For the sake of time, it gets cut out, but that's keeping your surface clean. I talked earlier about how I like to work on a very smooth surface and how when you spray the metallic base down, it leaves a little bit of a textured finish. And what I mean by that is you'll have little peaks and you'll have little valleys all over your canvas. Those little valleys will attract the overspray created while you're airbrushing your artwork, and it can wreak havoc on your design in the end if you don't take steps to remove that. One of the easiest ways to remove the overspray is just with a tack rag. All you do is just wipe the surface and it will pick up whatever overspray you have. You can see this one I've used numerous times with different colors. It's just got a sticky residue on it, and these work great. Another method you can use is wax and grease remover. I get a lot of questions on whether or not you can use wax and grease remover, especially with a water-based application. The answer is yes, you can. I use SprayMax wax and grease remover. This stuff is specifically designed for water-based applications. I've tried a few others. Some work well, some not so much. So if you're using something else, I would try and experiment with it on a test panel before you actually use it on your artwork. A couple things you need to know about the SprayMax. You need to give your artwork a little bit of time to dry. If you just set your airbrush down and you spray this down with wax and grease remover and go to wipe it off, you're probably going to remove some paint. Ask me how I know. So it's a good idea to take a break for 30 minutes to an hour. Let the paint cure before you use wax and grease remover. Another thing, you don't necessarily want to just hose down the panel itself with the wax and grease remover. You can, but again, you're kind of flirting with danger there. What I like to do is just spray it onto a paper towel. Just a little bit, it doesn't take much at all, and then you just wipe the surface. And make sure it's dried before you continue. That's all it takes. From here, you could take this in whichever direction you want. If you just want a green finish similar to what we did in part 1, you could take poison apple or even the emerald green candy and start working in the piece however you see fit. I'm going to go a little bit different route. I'm actually going to go with a lemon yellow next, and it's not going to take much, but we're going to add just a little bit of yellow to the eye. Obviously, I took the yellow a little further than just the eyeball like I said previously. In fact, I came in off camera and added more yellow after I stood back and looked at it. And the reason behind that is just experimentation, guys. I wanted to kind of see what transition I would get between the Midnight Blue Candy 2.0 and the Lemon Yellow Candy 2.0. You can see right above the eye, I had a very slight area of almost negative space where I had some very light blue shading. And once I came over that with the lemon yellow, now I've got a very smooth transition between the blue and the yellow, and it's got a green tinge to it, which is what I was looking for. You'll also notice that the blue is not quite as blue as it was. Now it's a very dark. The pupil itself, after just going over the midnight blue with the lemon yellow, is nearly black at this point, which again is what I was looking for. So experiment, don't be afraid. Now, if you're not sure of what effect you're going to get, I wouldn't recommend that you experiment on the panel you're painting, but you can grab a piece of paper and spray a couple colors down and see how they interact. That's how we learn, guys. Now, in this area, it's a little bit more on the gray, muddy side. That's okay. In the reference, this is a very dark area, and it's got some grayish green tones in it. So this is going to work out in the end. Once we come over this with the green candies, and remember, candies always darken. It will push this area back. We can continue to add more detail and texture if needed. But in the end, I think it'll all work out. Another point to mention is normally when you work with candies, you want full saturation. That's what gives you the rich, vibrant colors. With the yellow, I didn't go full saturation. I left it very light and almost pastel-y looking. And the reason behind that is if you look in the reference, the yellow in the eyeball itself is very pastel looking in the reference. So I wanted to keep that look, and you can do that with very light layers of candy. So from this point, I'll come in with the poison green candy, which is a very yellow green candy. It's heavily on the yellow side, but it's very bright, and we'll start to build in some green, and I think this thing will really come to life. I also came in after I sprayed the yellow and reestablished some of these highlights with an eraser, just because in the reference, these highlights are a lot more on the bright green side, not so much the yellow. So we'll come in with the poison green now and start to work this in. And like I said, I really think it'll come to life. You can see just how heavily yellow based this poison green Candy 2.0 is when you initially start spraying it. In fact, we probably could have got away with using the poison green in the white of the eye rather than the lemon yellow. So this poison green is actually going to erase all the yellow other than what's in the white of the eye. It will erase all the yellow that we sprayed previously, and that's okay, because like I said, I was experimenting with that yellow. I don't have as much experience with the water-based candies as I do with solvent-based systems, so I'm learning through this process as well. But eventually, this will turn to a green. It's super bright, almost a fluorescent color with enough coats. And I didn't count how many coats I put on, but if you gradually build it up, it eventually turns to a green. So here's what this color wound up. And as I said before, it's super bright. It's almost a fluorescent. That's why I like to use candies in my artwork, because that's the result it gives you. It intensifies the colors underneath the candy. It's a great tool to have in your arsenal. And remember that contrast is relative. The yellow, that lemon yellow that we put in the white of the eye, looked a lot brighter when this was surrounded by the metallic white. Now that we've got this green on here, it's very dull, very muted. It's been pushed back. So keep that in mind. From this point, I want to come back in with a couple of erasers and reestablish some of the highlights just below this eye. And then we'll come back in with some more candies and we'll continue to push some of this back and work some detail into it. Earlier we talked about erasing highlights back into your artwork, and you saw me erase some highlights back into it after I painted the midnight blue portion of the panel, and it erased very cleanly and very easily. But keep in mind that I was using the erasers pretty much immediately after I painted the midnight blue. In this case, I waited about 48 hours for the poison green to fully cure before I came in and started erasing these highlights that we're putting in now. And there's a huge difference in how easily the paint erases. I've got to work a lot harder at this point, so keep that in mind. If you allow the paint to cure, it's going to be more difficult. You can still erase it, but it's a lot more difficult. It requires more effort and more work, and it's not quite as clean. You won't be able to get the fades and transitions that you can if you erase, say, within 30 minutes to an hour after laying the color down. From this point, I like the brightness that we have going on here, but it's a little bit overpowering for what I want the look to be in the end. So what we can do is come in with a darker green candy and push a little bit of this back. So we have two candies to work from, poison green and emerald green. If you've watched part one, then you know emerald green candy is very, very dark. So what I've done is I've taken and mixed probably about 90% poison green with about 10% of the emerald green to give myself more of a medium tone that I can come in and push some of these areas back. That's one of the great things about the Createx line of products is you can intermix all of these products, and not just the Candy 2.0, one Candy 2.0 color with another Candy 2.0 color, but you can intermix them with the Auto Air line or the Wicked line and the Illustration line. So I'm using this color candy to not only darken or push back the fluorescent kind of value we have underneath this, but I'm also using it just like you would any other airbrush color to start to build form and add dimension to this piece. So not only am I trying to change the value or the tone of the green, but I'm also using this color to shade. And here I'm just throwing in a hint of texture using the R-Tool Mini FX Texture Effects stencils. These are by Gerald Mendez. These are invaluable. I use these all the time, whether it's the mini size or even the larger ones. And keep in mind when you're doing this, a true dye-based candy will always darken. So you can use this as just a glaze, putting a very light layer just to change the tone of that fluorescent green, and you can use it for the shading. The more coats you apply to one area, the darker and darker and darker it's going to get. But it's still a true transparent. In the end, you'll still be able to see every level of color that we add to this. This is where I start to get excited because it's really starting to take shape now. We built in some of the form in the shadowed areas with that last layer of candy. And it's still very bright and very vibrant, but we've knocked back some of that fluorescent look that we had going on. And I learned something else while it was off camera. But normally when I'm erasing highlights, I would have put down the poison green, and then I would have immediately come in with the poison and the emerald mix, and then I might come in and say I want to erase some highlights back in. The problem you run into is the paint is not fully cured at that time, so if you use an aggressive eraser like the Helix electric eraser, if you're not very careful, you stand a good chance of erasing through both of those layers right back down to the white base coat that we have underneath. Off camera, I started playing with the Helix and kind of brought some of these striations underneath the eye back in. And I found out that because I let that initial layer of poison green fully cure for about 48 hours, I can erase just the poison and the emerald mix alone, and it takes me right back to the underlying layer, which was just the poison green. So that's kind of a cool little effect and a good little tip for you guys. From this point, I want to, there's just a hint of some orange yellow in the reference. So I'm going to take a Tequila Candy 2.0 and put just a few little areas lightly dusted in here. It's the tequila yellow is a very orange yellow. Here's where things can get a little bit tricky if you're not very familiar with mixing colors. Now, we mix colors in the airbrush cup all the time, but you have to understand that when you spray one color on top of another on your canvas, you're also mixing the colors on that canvas. That's especially true when you're working with transparents. I mentioned color theory earlier, and color theory can be very basic or it can be very complex. There are books, great big thick books written on the subject. I'm not suggesting that you go out and become a master in color theory because that will take a lot of time, but you need a very basic understanding when it comes to airbrushing. For instance, where we'll run into trouble here is by adding this Tequila Candy, which is a heavily orange yellow based candy. To get orange, you have to mix red and yellow, two primaries. To make a green, you have to mix blue and yellow, again, two primaries. So by adding this orange now, I'm effectively mixing all three primaries, which will give you a brown. Now, that's not a huge deal if you know that that's about to happen. But if you don't, it can wreak havoc on your work. So I know in some of these areas, this is going to turn to kind of a brownish tone, but it's not that big a deal because the browns will be mainly in the darker areas, and we can change that tone just a little bit by coming in with a green candy over the top of it later. Some overspray has been generated with these last few layers of candy. So here I'm just taking the helix and cleaning up the corner of the eye highlights, and I'll also clean up the iris. The next step in the process is to really start punching in some of these shadow areas. Now in reality, because candy will always darken, we could go back to the Poison Emerald Green mix and use that to start punching in these shadows, and eventually it'll get darker and darker and darker. The problem with that is it's going to take a lot of coats to get there. So I'm going to speed up the process by going straight to the Emerald Green candy, which we already know is very dark. I'm just using my fingers here as a shield to protect that highlight from overspray. Another thing you guys never see in my videos is I'm constantly stepping back about 6 to 10 feet to evaluate my work. When you're at painting distance, you're right up close in front of the canvas, and you don't always see things that need attention or mistakes or little tweaks that need to be made. Those stand out a lot more if you step back and view your work from a little bit of a distance. So, like I said, I'm constantly stepping back and reevaluating what I'm doing. And you might notice at the end when we cut from this scene to the next, the left side of the panel is actually a lot darker. And that's because I had stepped back after I turned the cameras off and was looking at it and thought, I need to adjust the value on the left side of this panel. I wanted it to go darker. So keep that in mind when you're painting. And here you see again, I'm trying to work these shadows off of that original line that I put in with the Midnight Blue Candy. And in the video, as this gets darker and darker, it almost gets hard to differentiate where the Midnight Blue line was and where these shadows are. But I can assure you that, remember, these are 100% transparent, true candies. So in the end, you'll see in a few minutes, once this is cleared, you'll still see every one of those layers. And another thing you might notice is I'm not necessarily always spraying in sort of an even manner. Here I'm just kind of putting blotchy strokes in, and that's just to add a hint of more texture. Pretty happy with where this is at this point. The next step is obviously we need to start filling in the iris. So there's another very specific reason why I use the circle template in the beginning to start rendering this eye. Because if we come in with candies and just start filling in this iris without masking anything off, overspray is going to drift into the white of the eye. I'm pretty happy with where the white of the eye is as far as value and tone at this point. I don't want any more, and I don't want a green halo outside of the iris either. So you could take some Frisket or even transfer paper, mask the panel off, and then just cut out the iris, but that takes a lot of time, and we all know time is money. This is a super easy, fast method to mask this area off. And that solves the problem. I'll put just a couple more pieces of tape just to make sure I don't get any overspray coming around that we don't want. I think that's good. So I kind of want, in my head, I kind of want this eyeball to really kind of glow. So I'm going to go in with just the poison green candy and see how that looks. And we may tweak it with the poison and emerald green mix a little bit if we needed, but we'll try it and see what happens. Remember to take your time with this. Build this color with light layers. It takes a while for this poison green candy to get built up to the value that I want. And again, you see me using my thumb to mask the highlight in the eye. And eventually, you'll see me here in a minute pull the mask off, and then I take a step back and look at it, and the poison green candy was still just a little too much on the fluorescent side, too bright for the eyeball in my opinion, so I elected to put the mask back on, and then I went over it with a couple coats of the poison green and emerald green candy mix. After that, I'll come in with the Helix and just punch in a couple little highlights in the eyeball before going back over it with the candy. And then in the end, you'll see me use a pencil eraser to add some little specular highlights on that highlight in the eye. There you go, guys, the end result. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. Very bright, very vibrant, and at this point you can't even tell that there's a metallic base underneath. But once it's cleared and you take it outside in the sun and get a look at it, you can really see the advantage you get using the True Candies. Unfortunately, it has been overcast and raining here for days, so in order to get this video uploaded when I promised you guys I would, I had to improvise using a flashlight, which it's not the same effect, but it's the best I could do, guys. So when you compare what we did with part 1 side by side with what we did in part 2, you can really see why I prefer what we did in part 2 over part 1. This is much more bright, much more vibrant, and it has more depth. Now in reality, with part 1, you could take and use a lighter candy or even a few less coats of candy. You could use the blue and the yellow versus the black and the white. There are a number of different ways you can do this, but you're still not going to get the same effect as you will with layering candies. So it's all options, guys. Play with it. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you guys next time.